Hi guys, welcome to your first YouTube challenge. I hope you enjoy your homework today. We're going to be reading one of my favorite books. It's called Bad Day at Riverbend. It's by one of my favorite authors, Chris Van Allsburg. As we're reading the book, I want you to be paying very close attention to the pictures because they actually give you some clues as to what's going on to help solve the mystery of what's going on in Riverbend. We've been studying adjectives in class. We know that adjectives describe a noun, and we're going to be using adjectives to paint beautiful pictures with our words when we get started in narrative. So I'm going to be pointing out to you some adjectives as we go. So, you guys ready? Here we go. Bad Day at Riverbend by Chris Van Allsburg. Riverbend was a quiet little town, just a couple dozen buildings alongside a dusty road that led nowhere. Though the stagecoach occasionally rolled through town, it never stopped there, because no one ever came to Riverbend, and no one ever left. It was the kind of place where one day was just like all the rest. But one morning, Sheriff Ned Hardy stood in front of the Riverbend jail and saw something he'd never seen before. A brilliant light in the western sky. It lasted a few minutes and then faded away. Sheriff Hardy went to the jailhouse. He was sitting quietly at his desk, wondering what the strange light meant, when a loud pounding rattled the jailhouse door. The sheriff opened it and saw Owen Buck, the blacksmith's boy, breathing so hard he could barely speak. In between gasps, Ned Hardy heard the words, "Stagecoach," and "something awful." The sheriff followed Owen outside. The coach had never stopped in Riverbend before, but now it stood motionless at the end of the street. A crowd gathered around it, but they held back as they were afraid to get too close. It was easy to see why. The horses were covered with great stripes of some kind of shiny, greasy slime. "What is it, Sheriff?" someone asked as Ned Hardy stepped up to the coach. He didn't know. It was the strangest thing he had ever seen. The strangest thing anyone had ever seen. So we used shiny and greasy to describe the slime. He called them slime that's all over the horses. The horses were nervous and breathing hard. They looked terrible, their smooth white coats scarred with the strange stuff that hung from them in loopy ropes or stuck out like stiff wires. The sheriff grabbed a piece with both hands. It was slippery. He gave it a pull and the horses jerked away and whinnied in pain. Whatever it was, it stuck to them as sure as their flesh. "Where's the coachman?" Sheriff Hardy asked. "Gone," someone answered. "The coach came into town without him." So they're loopy ropes and stiff wire. I wrote the adjectives in purple and the nouns that the adjectives are describing in green. No, orange. Ned Hardy wasn't sure what to do. He scratched his head. "Well," he finally said, "I guess I'll go look for him." The sheriff rode out of town, following the wagon's trail. Before long, he stopped his horse. The ground was covered with the same marks that were on the horses. Whatever happened must have happened here. He didn't see any sign of the driver, but he heard a muffled sound. Ned Hardy got off his horse and discovered the coachman sitting on the ground behind a rock. The poor man looked awful. He was covered with the greasy slime. Thick stripes of the stuff ran across his eyes and mouth. He couldn't see or speak except to mumble. Look at the picture, guys. What's it going on? What's it look like? The sheriff helped the coachman up and led him to the horse. As they rode together back to Riverbend, Ned Hardy heard the sound of thundering hoofbeats. He rode to the top of the ridge and looked down on a charging herd of cattle. many marked with the awful slime that covered his poor saddle mate. When he turned his back toward town, he saw the same bright light in the sky that he'd seen that morning. It was just beyond the horizon, right over Riverbend. It didn't last long. I want to stop and point this one out because thundering is telling me how those hoofbeats sound. So your adjectives aren't only painting a picture of what you can see, they're also going to tell me more about what you can hear. Maybe you can smell, or maybe you can taste, or the way something feels. As he approached Riverbend, it was clear to Ned Hardy, even from the distance, that something terrible had happened. Riding into town, he could barely bring himself to look at the buildings, now covered with the hideous marks and stripes. The sheriff got out of the saddle. The town looked deserted. But when he passed the hotel, someone called out, "Sheriff!" Ned Hardy helped the coach driver down and led him to the hotel. The townspeople and some cowboys were gathered inside. A few were covered with the greasy slime. They all told the same story. Without warning, the sky overhead had filled with a brilliant light, a light that froze everything it touched, herds of cattle, even birds in the sky, and it was blinding. "Like stepping out of the privy and looking straight at the sun at high noon," one of the cowboys said. "Couldn't see a thing." When the light passed, they were covered with these greasy marks. "What are we going to do, Sheriff?" someone asked. "We can't spend our lives hiding in here." "No," Ned Hardy said. "No, we can't." He walked outside and stood in front of the hotel. His bravery inspired the others, and they joined him there. They looked at their poor town. Pretty little Riverbend was now too ugly for words. "Look," someone shouted, pointing at the sky above the hills just out of town. The mysterious light had appeared. Some people ran back to the hotel, but Ned just stared at the strange light without blinking an eye. "Whatever evil thing has done this is out in those hills," he said, pointing in the direction of the light. "I aim to ride out there and put an end to this." Now, I wanted to stop and point out this because for several times during the book now we've been talking about this light, and he's been calling it a strange light, a strange light. And so he decided to change and say a mysterious light, because if you say the same words over and over again, sometimes we get tired of hearing them. So as you're using your adjectives, try to vary your adjectives and come up with some new and original ones. The sheriff left town with a posse of well-armed men. They followed the trail of light. It wasn't hard to tell where it had been. The greasy streaks were everywhere. The men even saw them floating in the sky. But the light they sought always appeared just beyond the horizon, just out of reach. Then they saw the mysterious light shine brightly over the next hill. The men crawled up the hill, but the light faded away as they peeked over the top. Looking down, the brave cowboy saw something that made them gasp. There was a man standing perfectly still at the bottom of the hill, and he was as tall as a cottonwood tree and as skinny as a broomstick. I love those similes. And he looked like he was made entirely out of the greasy stuff that now covered the countryside. Ned Hardy was sure that this long-legged fellow was the cause of all their grief. They only had one chance. They'd have to get close enough to take a shot at the skinny devil before he used the light to freeze them. They crawled back to their horses. Ned Hardy gave a silent signal, and the posse charged forward. But just as they came over the hill, they were frozen in the bright light that suddenly filled the sky. Do you see something that looks different on this page? Is that maybe a clue as to what's going on? And then the light went out. So on your comprehension check on Friday, you're going to need to know what's going on with the light and a little bit more about adjectives. I hope you enjoyed.